Dear listeners, and welcome back. I have returned from what I refer to as the Southern Parsonage, the place, our home away from home, our vacation land of the sun and sand. My dad, I think we call it the land of fruits and nuts. That might be California. We were in Florida for a couple of weeks on vacation, my wife and I, and it was just a good time away. It was hot, it was sunny, but there was a pool within steps and an ocean within a few more steps. So it was just a good time away for just us. I read a bunch of books, didn't bring my phone, didn't bring my computer, but we did watch the last two episodes where I was absent, an interview with Ron Baylor, which was excellent. It was good to hear his testimony.
Rock on, Ron.
Yeah, and also an interview with Caleb Carpenter from Redeemer Covenant in Arlington, Ohio, a sister fire church. So our church is a part of the Fire Fellowship. The fellowship, it's FIRE stands for Fellowship of Independent Reformed Evangelicals Fellowship, Fire Fellowship. So we're heavy on the fellowship.
Emphasis.
Right, the emphasis is on the fellowship. So today I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit of doctrine, a little bit of what the Bible teaches. And one of the things that early on in my ministry here at the church, so this is probably in 2012, end of 2012, we sort of reworked our entire membership process. I think I've talked about this in some other episodes where we had a church membership, but there was no role. Like nobody had the roles. Maybe the previous pastor did, he took them with him. So we didn't know who was and who was not actually members of the church. And so we just said, let's just start over. And when we did that, I started calling it covenant church membership. And in our documents, when you become a member, you get a packet, or when you ask about membership, you get a packet. This is new that we've just started doing it. So if I remember to give you one, I try to. But one of the things that we say is our commitments, and we ask for a new member to commit to these things because we are all committing to this together. And the very first thing is this. We believe that covenant church membership is a biblical prescription that clarifies who is part of a local church and our responsibilities toward one another. Now, I thought what we should do is talk about the word covenant and the theology behind covenant. And even, I don't know if we'll get into covenant church membership. It's kind of a different thing, but it's connected, the covenant part of that. So let me start with this, and I'll throw it to Lee to begin with. How do you define a covenant, or how do we define what a covenant is, biblically speaking?
Yeah, the explicit biblical covenants are an arrangement, an agreement made between a sovereign and that sovereign's subject or subjects. So in its basic form, and actually in a secular way, we engage in covenants all the time, but they're usually called agreements or terms and conditions, that kind of a thing. But it's an agreement of, and actually they used to be called a suzerain treaty, where the suzerain or the sovereign makes a declaration and then calls people to agree to it, and then they would go forward in what was agreed to. So these kinds of arrangements are made up throughout Scripture, but that's what we're really talking about when a sovereign, a king, that kind of a personage makes an agreement with people under his care, under his rule.
Okay.
And brings them in.
So you mentioned like that we use covenants in current day. So marriage is a covenant agreement that two parties have together, right? A man and a woman, a husband and a wife, they make a covenant agreement. I will do this. It's the vows, right? Mm-hmm. I will do this. The other person says, I will do this.
Anytime you have to put your signature on the dotted line of something, you're actually engaging in a covenant. With a company, with another person, there's an agreement that's being brought together.
So how is it related? Go ahead, Steve.
Well, so I think in helping understand what we mean when we use this word covenant, I think it is helpful to kind of do a little bit of a compare and contrast between the way we're using the word covenant and the way the world might use the word contract, right? So if you
Yeah, good. That
are
was
going to,
exactly what I was going to ask.
yeah, if you're going to go buy a car, for example, or you're going to go into business with someone, very often there's some sort of contract, and they tend, as time goes on, to get longer and longer because they keep getting filled with different ways that you can essentially weasel out of it. Or
Yeah.
here's all the conditions in which, forget it, I'm not fulfilling any of the things I said I was going to do in this contract. And
Right.
oh, by the way, if you don't hold up your end of the deal, well, I'm for sure not holding up my end of the deal. And one of the things we would say as church leaders is one of the issues that we have with how the world treats marriage, for example, is that you have a lot of people going into a marriage contract, even though they're actually entering into a covenant. But their mindset is contractual, not covenantal. So
Yeah,
so
if you do
covenant,
this, I will do that.
right? I'm going to hold
Yeah.
up my end of the deal as long as she still looks like that in 20 years.
Right.
Or I'm going to hold up my end of the deal as long as he still makes this much money.
Yeah.
Or they just turn out not to be a sinner who's hard to live with sometimes, or whatever,
Mhm.
right? Like, that's not going to work.
Mhm.
So that's why we call it, that's why we use the terminology we use. We use a marriage covenant. And I would even say, you stand up there and you covenant with the girl, and the girl covenants with you, but you two are also covenanting before God Almighty.
Right.
So there's a third party involved here. And so covenants, in this sense, whether it's marriage or some other things, it's a weightier matter than, hey, Lee, let's open up a coffee shop together and we'll write a contract. And
And
it's
then our lawyers will look
certainly
it over.
yeah, I mean, it's certainly a weightier matter than, hey, Dana, how about you and I, let's start working out in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, right? Like, if we blow either one
Don't
of
take
those
it.
things, it's not the same as blowing your marriage covenant or other
Right.
covenants. A
Right.
covenant is a weightier thing. You ought not to enter a covenant lightly, because part of what you're doing when you enter a covenant is you're kind of saying, if I should not hold up my end of the deal, may God pour out his almighty wrath on me. That it's
Yeah.
that kind of a arrangement, which, when you say it like that, well, that's the exact opposite of a contract. A contract is, if this thing even looks like it's going wrong, I'm out.
Mhm.
These are not
Yeah.
the same things.
Yeah.
And so we want to have clarity about the difference between the two.
But there's some overlap, right?
There
Like,
is overlap, yes.
so there are. So I was thinking, as you're talking about like marriage, like we used to have to. Um, now the terminology is file for divorce, right?
Mhm.
So if you're going to break up your marriage covenant, you just file for divorce, and because of no fault divorce, it's pretty easy to do. It's $300 or whatever, and you file the paperwork and then you split your assets. But you used to have to sue for it,
Mm-hmm.
and so it was a much more difficult process to get out of. To use your analogy, it wasn't like when you finance a car, and if you don't hold up your end of the bargain, they just repo it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, right.
it's traumatic for a half an hour, and then you move on with life, and
Mhm.
and it messes up with your credit, but it doesn't destroy your family.
Yeah.
Whereas marriage is that way. So let's get into the
Okay.
biblical covenants then. Um, so there are some explicitly, like the language for covenant is used. There are some explicitly biblical covenants. So I'm gonna start with, well, let's start with Adam and in the garden. Even though the word covenant is not used in Genesis 2
Right.
and 2 and 3, even though the word is not used there, it is used in Hosea 6:7, referring back to it, and all of the language is covenant language. So starting there, and we're going to come back to that, I think. But what are the covenants, and then how did they? Let's just kind of talk about it, like each one. Um, who were the parties involved, and what were the sort of the I will do this and you do that type of arrangements? So Lee, why don't we start with, let's just start with Adam.
Yeah, so with Adam, in Genesis 2, so Yahweh took the man and put him in the garden to work it and keep it. So part of the covenant is assigning responsibilities. The sovereign has a responsibility, which is declared in the covenant, and then he holds the subject to his responsibility, or if it's with an entire nation, the nation's collective responsibility. So Adam is charged with working the garden and keeping it. And then he commands him, then he has additional commandments specifically about how he's to eat the fruit that the garden produces under his work.
Yeah.
So he's supposed to work. And actually, this concept of working and keeping the garden is very, very important, because that language actually plays into later commands about priesthood in Old Testament Israel, which would be subsumed under the Mosaic covenant, which we'll get to. But that is drawing all the way back to the initial responsibility that God was holding Adam to, which is to work and keep God's temple, the world. But anyway, that's an important one. And then, of course, so the matter of what you should and shouldn't eat in the garden, God very immediately says, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, because you will die the day that you eat from it. And that is the part. So in a covenant that cannot be broken, so that'll be a little teaser for later too. But this is a covenant where God is specifically giving a commandment to Adam that he must keep, otherwise the covenant will be violated. And so that part, the keeping in the working in the keeping, Adam kind of doesn't do very well at. He should have kept the serpent out and away from his wife. So he fails there. But then he fails ultimately as well, and this is what is repeated later on when Adam's sin is recounted over and over again in the Old and New Testament, is that eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which both Eve does and Adam does as well. And so that covenant is broken, and we know that because then the punishment that is given with it, the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Even though that doesn't come about in the actual physical death of Adam and Eve, they do die in the way that Paul says all people are dead in trespasses and sins. And they're expelled from the garden, can no longer go. It's guarded by an angel with a flaming sword. No one goes to Eden again, and they have to go live east of Eden and forge a life now under sin, under just punishment. So God made a covenant, and it was, we think of it as relatively simple: work and keep the garden, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He breaks both, and then receives the punishment that is very much laid out in that covenant. So even though the word isn't used, all those concepts are right there.
Right. Yeah. So the punishment of death and also removal from the garden.
Yeah.
Right. So and I want to be clear about this, because I think this makes sense later, kind of down the line. Who is the covenant just with Adam? Who is the covenant between?
No, so there's several times in the biblical covenants you have a covenant made with what we will call a federal head, and federal is just another word for covenant. So like we talk about the federal government, we have a federation of states. The 50 states of the United States are bound together by covenant, actually.
Be careful.
By our version of
probably listening, since you're talking,
right.
They're probably listening to this now. The FBI.
They're probably listening. Yeah, you're welcome. We'll be on our best behavior now, but
hopefully they're hanging on every word.
So this Adamic covenant, or sometimes always is alternately called the covenant of works, is made with Adam on behalf of all of his descendants. So he is a federal head. He is sort of the head of the covenant, the head of the whole soon-to-be human race, who undertakes this covenant with God, breaks it, receives the just punishment, and then everyone who comes after him receives that same punishment because we have all sinned in him. He is our representative before God at this time. And so every human being born after Adam and Eve are born into that broken covenant of works in
Yeah,
him.
so Romans 5 makes that really like explicitly clear, right? Paul makes that very clear, comparing Adam to Jesus. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that because I think that plays through the other covenants as we go. So let's take it to Steve. He's been quiet for a little bit, so I'm sure he wants a challenge. So the next,
Right.
we start thinking, so now you're in Genesis chapter 2. 3 is when they break the covenant and are issued the punishment. Chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9 brings us to another covenant, which is whom, Steve?
So this one people may not associate with a covenant, but they'll recognize the person kind of who's in the spotlight there, which would be Noah. So we see the degeneration of mankind, all who follow Adam. And I think it's worth noting here that we're all bearing the weight of Adam blowing it, even though we did not grant Adam permission. He just did it to us. He didn't need our permission. He ruined us spiritually, whether we wanted to be ruined or not. So that progresses, and it gets worse and worse until it kind of comes to a head in Genesis 6, where God, the way it's described is God looks upon the world, and it even says things like every intent of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually.
Yikes, bro.
And so there's something unique. There's something similar to what we see when we look around the world today. And then there's something a little bit unique here. I mean, we can see even unbelievers do honorable things today. So we're all spiritually ruined without Christ. We'll get there. We've got a few covenants to get there, but there's something like particularly awful about the state of the world and mankind at this point in history. And so God, in order to I think demonstrate for us how serious he takes this sin thing, it's not simply that, okay, Adam and Eve and all their descendants, their innocence really did die in the day that they ate of the fruit, and we get a description of that in previous chapters. It's not simply the shame, it's not simply that, but it just keeps getting far worse than Adam ever would have imagined. He never would have imagined it would have gone this far. And so we don't get gory details. There's not some like explicit rated R version of what's going on there, but it seems by implication clear that it is horrifying. It is like the worst, worse than any apocalyptic movie or book you've ever read. It's that and worse, right? And so God, in a kind of miraculous but powerful demonstration of how seriously he takes this sin problem, he destroys all life on earth, man and beast, all life on earth, but for one family, Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. And he preserves those, this family in an ark, which was gigantic, even by today's standards of construction, is almost impossibly large and would be outrageously expensive and would have taken a really long time to, you never would have got the permits for this. Let's put it this way. Noah didn't have that problem, but the resources involved in an ancient world was just, must have seemed insurmountable. Noah's probably really wealthy in order to even do this. But so their lives are preserved, and the only human lives preserved in the ark. So it's appropriate to see the ark as the ark is life. There's salvation there, and they go through this ordeal. They survive the flood. The waters recede. Eventually, they emerge from the ark, and God makes a covenant with Noah and his family, and that would be all of us, everyone listening to this and participating in this podcast is Noah's family.
Mhm.
And God essentially covenants that I will never again destroy all life on the globe in this way with the flood. And he says that the sign of this covenant is the bow in the sky. And I think that it's that
Mhm.
kind of wording is used intentionally because, again, this is an ancient world context that's a little different from our modern world. A
Yeah.
bow in the ancient world is a weapon of war.
Yeah.
Right. So the symbolism here of putting my bow down. So we in our world we might say I'm going to put my gun down. That might be a more modern equivalent, right? I'm not going to aim my gun at you to destroy you in the way that I destroyed all life this way. It's a symbol of peace.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to pour out my wrath on humanity in this way, and that's good news. Now the symbol, the rainbow in the sky, has been hijacked. It's been culturally appropriated in an
Boo.
evil, demonic, satanic way.
Yeah.
But it was ours first. Let's put it that way. And so that is what we would call the Noahic covenant. We have peace from God's wrath, at least from this form of God's wrath.
And
So
it's
what's
interesting.
fascinating? What's fascinating about that, even the sign, right? The rainbow. It's a picture of God like you said, God puts his bow down, and we step out, after a rainstorm often, and there's a rainbow, and or even a double rainbow sometimes, and it means
All the way
something
across the sky.
all the way across the sky, and it means something. It means God's it is pointing us to God's grace, his mercy, his peace, his love towards his people, all of those things. So there's a sign that means something that
Yeah.
that has been hijacked.
I gave you only this much rain because at one time I gave so much rain it flooded the whole earth. So
Yeah,
I'm putting the bow down now. The rain's over.
yeah. I literally poured out my judgment on humanity.
Yeah.
But Noah found grace or favor in the eyes of God.
And it's interesting too when the business is done, everybody's out of the ark, and God makes that covenant. If you compare the language of Genesis, the end of Genesis 8, beginning of Genesis 9, with the covenant with Adam, a lot of the same words and phrases are used. This is called recapitulation, a restatement of the same covenant. So God, in a very real sense, renews the covenant that he made with Adam with Noah, and the terms are slightly different. So it's still be fruitful and multiply, which always stands. But then he gives a literal allowance for not just to eat the green things of the ground, but to eat animals now as well. Animals can be your food. And then makes the sign of the rainbow, which would be the first sign of a promise that God has made to man. There were some implicit promises with Adam, but this is a tangible sign of promise that God has made. And so I think that's always interesting to point out when talking about the Noahic covenant too.
So is there a sign in the Adamic covenant? There isn't one, right?
Not in any real sense like that. The only thing I could think of as a sign would be that Adam would walk in the cool of the day with the Lord and speak with him. It's not really a sign, but it's a level of fellowship that none of the rest of creation is granted. So he makes a covenant with Adam, and he actually walks with Adam. So again, that's probably a little bit of a stretch, but it is unique to Adam pre-fall that nobody
Because
else
the
has
rest
gotten
of
to
them
do.
all have signs, right? So
Yeah.
so Noah is the rainbow. So let's get into the next one then. Is the covenant with Abraham? So this is where God's people are specifically called out with Abraham. We see the story starts actually right after the Tower of Babel, where God, so Genesis chapter 11, where God does a little bit of wrathful stuff, confuses the language, and like sends people abroad. So he's not pouring out his wrath in the same way, but he's making it difficult for man. But then he calls Abraham out of the land of Ur. And so you see that begin in the chapter 11, but then you see the actual covenant given in the first verses of chapter 12, as he tells him to go, leave your father's house and go to the land that I will show you. So the Abrahamic covenant is Genesis 12, verses 1-3, and it's actually, it builds through Genesis. So yeah. You have sort of the basics in Genesis chapter 12, then the covenant is enacted in chapter 15, and then chapter 17, I have to turn there.
Right, that's the circumcision of Isaac.
So the sign
that's the sign.
Yeah.
Or not of Isaac, but the sign.
Yeah. So
Abraham is.
So the promise, so the covenant with Abraham, he gives him this covenant promise where God says, I will make you a great nation. So it's land, seed, and blessing. So I will give you the land that I will show you. So the promised land, that's where we get that kind of language. So the land that I will show you, make you the father of a great nation, and who will bless through you will all the nations be blessed. So that's God's promise of the Abrahamic covenant. What's Abraham's responsibility in that covenant, Lee?
Oh, he must circumcise his son. So there's a certain a covenant community is granted in this. Talking about the promised land, it's a promise of a nation as well that would inhabit that land.
Yeah, right.
And the full fruition of that is there must be a nation from which the Messiah is to be born. And so that directly comes out of the Abrahamic covenant, because this is the beginning of the Israelite Hebrew Jewish nation. And so and part of that is that the sign for that nation is circumcision in the flesh. And so that's hugely important as well. And then just a general call to obedience, to following Yahweh. So there's the peculiarity. Right. He has to leave his land. There's a land that God's going to call him to, and he will give him not only a son, but actually so many descendants, it's going to be like the sands on the seashore. You won't even be able to count them. It'll be like the stars in heaven for counting. And all of these nations will be blessed in him, in Abraham. And so he's to follow the Lord, the instructions, and to worship. So somewhat implicitly as well in the covenant is the exclusivity of worshiping God, the God of Abraham.
Yeah. So, and I use the language seed, and I do it purposefully. It probably says it in some of the other versions. The ESV, I was just looking at it, says a great nation. But I try to
sometimes offspring is used.
Yeah, offspring. But that's a callback, right? Do you?
Yeah, I think it's important to maybe. I don't know if you wanted to get into this at this point, but with a lot of these covenants we're sort of chronologically going through, there's going to be not always immediate, but a more immediate and very visible, tangible, I could put my hands on it aspect to the covenant, but they're also pointing to something that's a bigger deal. And we're going to probably get into that here at the end. So all the way back in Genesis 3, we see a promise of, okay, Adam, this is kind of on you, buddy, and you blew it, but I'm going to fix this. And the fix is going to come from the seed of the woman. And so then Adam and Eve have a son, Cain, and they get all excited. Aha, we're going to get this fixed.
It happened.
So yes, they do get a blessing of children, but no, that's not really and so with Abram here, and eventually Abraham, who he and his wife are super old and have never had children. And so the promise on the one, it's sort of the immediate part of the promise is you're actually going to have children, and not just like a child, but from you will come descendants like sands on the seashore, right? So there's that, but there's also a promise of seed that's kind of hearkening back to Genesis 3, but also forward to somebody who's actually going to be a bigger deal than Isaac.
Yeah, that's going to crush the head of the serpent.
Right. Like, so
Yeah.
we're going to see this sort of thing, that it's not, it's this covenant, and there's specifics about each of these individual covenants, but they're also like pointing us to something in some way back to Genesis 3, but also forward to somebody. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody. We'll get it. We'll get there. But, so there's sort of an echo behind the immediate. Yes, Abraham's being promised land, seed, and blessing, but there's also there's more to it than that, kind of behind it. It's veiled right now, but we're going to get there.
What's interesting about that too is that so after Cain and Abel, Cain killed Abel, and then Cain was sent off into exile. They had Seth, and one of the things that Eve says when she names Seth is this, it's like, this is the son, right? So she thinks that this is going to be the one, this is going to be the savior, right? Now, but like you said, this is a way forward, and like there's going to be a whole line.
He might be at the head of that line, but yeah.
That's why the genealogies are so important, both in Genesis and then, in Genesis and then in Matthew and in Luke, to establish who that sign might be.
Yeah.
That this
connect
is
the dots.
Who God was talking about.
Yeah.
So it passes through Noah, obviously, and then into, now we're at Abraham. So now we have the father of a nation. Genesis essentially recounts the rest of that family's growth. So it leaves that family with 12 sons, but living in exile in Egypt because of a famine. And you can read that whole story. It's fascinating, but it's essentially one massive extended family. Genesis ends, Exodus opens, and it's, years later. What was it, 400 years later? It's
400
years
later.
Yeah. And that 12 brothers now is a whole nation. So they're the nation that God had promised, we're getting there, right? Except now they're in exile. They're not living in the land. They're not a blessing to the rest of the world. Like they're actually
they're enslaved.
It looked that way because Joseph had worked his way up to like prime minister of Egypt or whatever, and now they're enslaved. So
the Bible even literally says there's a new leader who didn't know about Joseph, had no idea about the man.
Right. Saw the Hebrew people as good slaves, enslaved them. So now we get to Moses, and this is probably the most, it's among the most famous covenants. When people think of covenants, they think of Abraham, Moses, and David. So Moses, what is important about the covenant that God makes with Moses?
Oh man.
Yeah.
Where to begin? Big, and so this is coming, of course, downstream from the covenant with Abraham. There is a clearly defined nation here, a vast number of people, and God is continuing to cement the identity of that nation in him. And so it's so now there are commandments given, not just the 10 commandments, but there's a whole list,
a lot.
a whole bunch of laws that are given, and so as we read those, it's good to know the threefold division of the law. So there's moral law, then there's ceremonial law, and then there's civil law. So the civil law would be rules that are given within the Mosaic covenant for the government of the nation of Israel. And then there's the ceremonial laws. These would be sort of the laws for the devotional life of Old Testament Israel. This is where we get the dietary laws, the mixed fabric laws, all the little things that the world likes to try to hold us to because they don't understand covenant theology. what's been fulfilled and what hasn't. And then there's moral law, which God gives and which stands forever. So one of the beautiful things, especially, and I know we just keep spoiling it, but the way that all of these covenants point to a later fulfillment in one particular man, the God man, uh, is that there are laws that or parts of different covenants that are pointing to him, and once he comes, they are what's called abrogated. So not that they pass away, but they are fulfilled, and they're no longer binding on individual people the way that they were when that covenant stood. But what they do is they actually point to a particular ministry of the God man in how he serves and cares for his people. So we don't follow ceremonial law. We don't follow civil law given within the Mosaic covenant because those have been fulfilled by Christ as our high priest, our great prophet, and our king. But the moral law stands, and we are blessed in following it. We have the ability to follow it because of the work of the Holy Spirit in our hearts and the stony heart being replaced with the heart of flesh. So law is a huge part of the Mosaic covenant. And it does trip some people up if we don't know these divisions. And some people who, they actually do try to follow all of these things, believing that they're still bound to them. So we want to be free from that. We want to obey the law of Christ, and part of that is understanding the word that points to him, and what part of the word is still there for us to follow. So law is huge for this, and the law, as I said before, makes the nation of Israel peculiar in the sight of the nations, continues to preserve that identity so that the Messiah would be born from not only Israel, from the Israelites or the Hebrews, but that he would even emerge from a particular tribe, a particular lineage, which is foretold in the prophets too. So those things have to be maintained, and the law helped to maintain the nation that way. And then, of course, another aspect too is continuing that promise of the promised land, because as we know, after they leave Egypt, they then wander in the desert, and that generation's descendants are the ones that enter the land. That immediate nation that left Israel or that left Egypt never got to enter the promised land. And so the law was given to preserve them even as they wandered in their sin. Um, in a way, it's actually quite gracious, because we have now a big aspect is there's now a whole system of laws for making sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins, to placate the wrath of God, to act as a substitute propitiation for a time. So sacrificing bulls or turtle doves, or in different kinds of offerings to make atonement for sin, which is also pointing toward Christ. That is a huge aspect of the Mosaic covenant, that we're now attacking sin, which has plagued us for all this time. God actually set together a rather detailed order involving the spilling of blood, animal blood, because the life is in the blood, and sin cannot be atoned for outside of shedding of blood. And that is made very clear in the Mosaic covenant.
And then in the New Testament, Jesus does this in the Sermon on the Mount, and then Paul makes this very explicitly clear, that the law was given to reveal our sin, right? So when Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, you shall not, look at a woman, or you shall not commit adultery," I'm telling you, if you even look at it, like he's saying, it's deeper than we think. It's actually within our hearts, not just our outward actions.
Right.
And Paul is actually saying, and essentially, you know what? It is impossible to obey the law fully because it's internal as well. We do it without even thinking about it because we're dead in our trespasses and sins.
Yeah, I think that one of the things we don't, people may think this sounds kind of funny, but this covenant is to demonstrate that drawing near to God, and anything that resembles how Adam enjoyed it before Genesis chapter 3 is conditional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
Like it's not you don't get to approach him just how you are. And somebody better follow this law exactly, or none of you
or you're doomed,
are going to come into my presence.
Right.
And so it is supposed to drive us to being poor in spirit. We're jumping over some other covenants, but it is appropriate that we look at the crushing burden of the Mosaic covenant and go, what hope could we possibly have? And the rest of that, the rest of the Old Testament is a never-ending series of utter failure, like of just people, like, where we get to sit there and tisk and shake our head and say, well, I would never do that. And then we'll get into in the New Testament, yeah, you would. Yeah, you're just like them. Yeah,
that's a really good point. That the rest of the Old Testament is just, examples of utter failure.
It's a disaster. It's not happy. It's yeah.
So that tells us that we're still under the covenant of works, right?
Yes.
Do this and you will live.
Right.
Do these things and you will live. Right.
This is the condition for being near me.
And yet, to go back to something Lee said a little bit ago, there still is grace in this.
Yes.
Because God does give them a way out, but he still saves in the same way.
Right.
So I think of the rich young ruler coming to Jesus, all these I have kept since my youth. Right. What does the Lord say? Do this. All these I've kept in my youth, right? From my youth. Like, so first of all, no, you didn't. And that's why, Jesus says, go, sell all that you have and give it to the poor.
Just broke the commandment against bearing false witness.
Right, yes. I'm going to show you in one simple thing that you did not obey all of the law. But that doesn't mean that nobody was saved in the Old Testament, saved in the is with Jesus now type of idea, because Abraham believed God, he trusted God's promises, and God credited that to him as righteousness. Yep. That is explicitly stated several times throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So he didn't. I don't know if he knew he didn't know every jot and tittle of New Testament, prophecy and all of that, but he knew that God was the one who would save.
But he had faith.
Right. Yeah. His faith that saved him.
Right.
Not his works.
Right.
So
Yes. Okay. Yeah, because faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. And that's not just true in the New Testament era and after. It was also true before the New Testament, in the Old Testament era. Except those guys heard the word of God directly.
Yeah.
In that period.
Yeah. This is probably worth hitting this point. So people in the Old Testament, we're not saying, well, nobody in the Old Testament made it because they blew it on the Mosaic covenant, right? So they did. So we are saying they all blew it in the Mosaic covenant,
right?
But some, not all of Abraham's descendants, but some did have faith, and because they believed, God's going to credit to their account somebody else's, stay tuned, perfect righteousness of perfect obedience to the Mosaic covenant, to the law.
That's such a good way to put it.
He's going to credit their account, so that they are treated as if they've met those conditions to draw
accounted
near.
As righteous, even
they
though
were
they're
accounted as righteous.
Because you're talking about Christ's imputed righteousness, right?
Right.
That's still in the Old Testament.
Right.
Yeah, that even people in the Old Testament are being saved because of what Christ.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
It isn't just that God just kind of says, okay, all right, well, Jesus hasn't come yet, but you don't even know about this, but don't worry about it.
Yeah, there's none of that. Yeah, there's no free passes necessarily.
What better sign of that could that you go all the way back to Adam and Eve's sin when they realize that they're naked after eating the fruit? We get the very first animal sacrifice to cover sin, where God actually kills animals and makes skin clothes for Adam and Eve to wear. He's already covering their sin, even at that point. He's covering
their shame. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a that little verse when you read through that, you just like blah 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 blah. Oh, and Adam made him clothes. Okay, don't even catch. Oh wait,
There's
this is a leather shirt and suede pants. Like God is. They're not made out of palm leaves anymore. Like
Yeah.
something died
yeah.
Mhm.
to clothe them. That's such a good and such a subtle point there in Genesis 3.
God, the original tailor, as well. It's very important.
Okay, so we're Mosaic covenant. Now we have the law. We're still under the covenant of works. What's the next covenant? Lee.
You go quite a ways to the Davidic covenant.
Ah,
Quite a ways. So there are some, I like to think of them as sort of micro covenants within
yeah.
the Mosaic covenant anyway, because you can kind of think about the priesthood as a kind of covenant, but it is
Yeah.
subsumed.
Levi.
Yeah, right. The covenant with Levi's tribe. They carry on that keeping and guarding, tending thing that was commanded of Adam in the
Yeah.
beginning. It's sort of a priestly order type of command. They're charged with carrying that out over not only the tabernacle once it's built, but then that once the temple is built, they observe that there as well. So that's worth mentioning before we move on from the Mosaic covenant. Um, so then God makes a covenant with David regarding kingship. He makes a promise that your son will sit on my throne forever. And then Solomon happens and he gets to build the temple, and everybody's like, "Oh, it's gonna happen, this is the guy." And then he does what he does and dies. But so obviously not the guy, but a very blessed guy.
Mhm.
um so again, another covenant that points toward an ultimate fulfillment, even though there's an immediate fulfillment where David's literal, actual, physical son Solomon sits on the throne and rules. But we're looking toward a greater and better David, a greater uh, a greater Solomon to come, who will sit on the throne, but actually won't die. He'll always retain the throne. This is a great messianic promise that the Messiah would be the king of his people, and would be an eternal king, not one who's subject to wars or, as was so often in the history of Israel and then later Judah's kings, where either a brother tries to supplant the one who has the throne, or rebels from outside try to overthrow the king so they can take the throne. He won't be subject to any of these kinds of problems that normal human kings face. He'll actually um, retain his sovereignty forever. And of course, we know as Jesus sits on his throne, he's a throne he's always had. But for our benefit, we know that he attains to that throne, um, and is blessed in his incarnation, in his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. And in his ascension, uh, we often forget this step, but there's the session of Christ, the seating of Christ at the right hand of God the Father Almighty, which we confess every time that
Right.
we say the Apostles' Creed, and it's important because that session is the fulfillment. It's right in the bulletin, even though I
Yeah.
call it the hymnal every time I'm up there, but I don't know why I do that. Uh, but uh, that event that happens, is really that crowning achievement, if you will, sitting on that throne, which he not only has, but really rightly would have earned anyway, having done what he did. Um, and so when we confess the session of Christ, the seating, this is the Son of David.
Yeah.
This is the kingly Son of David, rightfully on his throne for all eternity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Psalm 110 talks about that too. Right. Sit at my right hand. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. That's the ascension and crowning of the King David. Sorry, I interrupted you, Steve.
No, it's just to point out again, like there are some like seemingly immediate results of some of these covenant. Like if you could have taken Abraham and he could have hopped in the DeLorean with Doc and Marty, and you brought him to Solomon's rule, I mean, this is kind of like the high watermark in an earthly sense of this kingdom. And Abraham would be like in full high five mode, right? Like, oh, there you go.
Yeah.
But no, there you don't go. Like that's not it. There's more to it than this. And so again, you have sort of a kind of a temporal, because it didn't last long. I mean, as soon as Solomon dies, it goes downhill bad, fast.
The country splits up. Yeah.
But at the time of his rule, I mean, Israel was kind of a big deal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They were wildly wealthy and powerful. They were a kind of almost a superpower in their part of the world. Like they were a really big deal. But that's not exactly. Yes, it sort of meant that, but not really. Like there's more. There's something way more significant to it. In the same way, we would say that about the Abrahamic covenant, and now with the Davidic covenant. Yeah. There's more coming here. That's this today, as amazing as it is with all the gold and the throne and everything, that kind of pales by comparison to what's coming.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So
and also, well, and one other thing too, the Davidic covenant does cement a particular sort of bookmark of physical lineage of the Messiah. You look for a descendant in the flesh from David's own line. So that's why it's so important that Mary and Joseph have to go to Bethlehem to be counted, because Joseph was of the line of David. So even though Jesus was not physically Joseph's son, he is in the line of David through Joseph. And that's that should have been an obvious thing, but of course the people had blinders on and didn't notice it. They didn't even know that he was born in Bethlehem because he lived in Nazareth and grew up in Nazareth. So people are like, well, who's he? He's from the backwater of Nazareth. He can't be the guy.
Yeah. So we get the promise goes from so the covenants. So the promise, God's promise, one of them is the seed of woman who will crush the head of the serpent. So we see that seed then goes through Noah's family and through Shem.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. I just want to make sure I said that right.
Yeah.
Canaan was the one that was cursed.
Yeah.
So through
that's
Shem,
how we get the word Semitic, actually.
Okay.
It goes even back to that. Yeah.
So then through and Abraham, and it doesn't go through Moses, but now we have a nation. So actually in the tribe of Judah. So now we have a nation, and Moses is the representative, so the covenant head, the covenant mediator between the people and God. So he's made a covenant with a nation. So previously it's been people, now it's a nation, or families. Now it's a nation, and now you have David. So there's a covenant with the king, right? So now we're getting into in both in Ezekiel and in Jeremiah, there's talk of a new covenant. And how are we doing on time? We probably need
terribly.
to make
Terribly.
Yeah,
we're
right at the hour.
Why don't we stop it there? And we'll pick it up next week. I almost said next Lord's Day. Next podcast. We'll pick it up next week with the new covenant, and then we'll talk about some overarching covenant themes. So we're still all in the covenant of works, but we're coming to a new covenant, which is new. So why don't we stop it right there? So put a bookmark in that new covenant next week. Do we have any listener questions?
Do we ever? We have a listener question, and I think this will be relatively quick for us to answer. It was simply, what are any recommended resources that you have for good, solid theological teaching that we can fill our eyes or ears with throughout the week? Any recommended resources? Whether I assume whether that means books, podcasts, YouTube channels, blogs. Do blogs still exist? I don't know.
I don't know.
I think those are called podcasts now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I was thinking of I'm gonna put three ministries that are kind of publishing houses, but they do all of those things. Usually they have like newsletters or like journals, also podcasts, multiple podcasts sometimes in some of these cases, and also they publish and write books. So three that I would recommend. One is the Ligonier Ministries.
Nice.
Pretty much anything Ligonier puts out, listen to it. It's good stuff. They've got a bunch of different podcasts from church history to like practical theology. There's all kinds of stuff. So anything by Ligonier Ministries. They do conferences. Go to them. The second one that I would recommend is Banner of Truth Trust, which started as a publishing house in London. And that's pretty much what they do. They do have a podcast where they go through and read some of their old stuff. They've got newsletters and conferences. But they are publishing, typically, they've got some newer stuff, but typically they're publishing Puritans. So people who have died long ago. Again, both with Ligonier and with Banner of Truth, they've got a Presbyterian flavor, which is not a bad thing, but we would have some disagreements sometimes. And so just doctrinal disagreements, but I still heartily recommend either of those two. And then the third one that I'm going to recommend, and I don't know if I'm stealing you guys's, probably, but
too late.
That's why I'm going first. Yeah. The third one that I would recommend is anything by Founders Ministries. So that's actually a ministry of Tom Ascol. His last name is Ascol. He's a pastor in Coral Ridge. Is it Coral Ridge?
Coral Springs?
Coral something, Florida.
Gulf Coast.
Gulf Coast. So Founders Ministries, they have a podcast. They're a Baptist ministry. He's a part of the SBC. And so sometimes he gets some of his podcasts are very specifically about SBC inner workings. I don't really care about all of that stuff, but some of them are excellent, and they're published goods. The books that they're publishing and articles and stuff is excellent.
The Mystery of Christ, for example, is published by Founders. I think the best text on Baptist covenant theology out there, written by Samwise Gamgee Renahan.
Also, for the Vindication of Truth is a commentary on the 1689 by James Renahan, Sam's dad, and then Exalting Christ. This is another good one. Both published by Founders. I have them at easy reach. Anyway, so those are some good resources. Are there any others?
Steve, what do you recommend?
So I had Ligonier at the top of my list, so I use them all the time. They're great. If it's about baptism, we'd probably not be right down the line. But other than that, it's really good. And so it would be one of my first places to go. So I would echo what Dane had to say about that. Yeah. Monergism.com. Really good. I mean, if you want to dig deep on a particular doctrinal thing that, man, I don't understand this, I'd like to get some articles about it or listen to something about it, it'll give you a tsunami of material about like all sorts of stuff. Yeah. So that one has been helpful. Podcasts, if you want to kind of explore like stuff out there in the world and why we don't believe that, Cultish will review, it'll have some interesting things. I know they just did a series not that long ago about Islam and the history of that. And we tend to think of that as all homogenized, like every Muslim agrees about everything with each other. And just like with Christians, not hardly, and so if you just wanted to educate yourself a little bit about those things, it has other things too, that are some of, you might find interesting. I've found interesting. Another one, Theocast. A couple of guys do basically kind of what we do, and they'll talk about different doctrinal things, and they're in the Reformed Baptist family tree, in that camp. And so they talk about a lot of stuff that I've found interesting and helpful. So those are a couple. I had Sam Renahan on my list also. Joel Beakey.
Oh, he's
his
excellent.
stuff.
Yeah.
He's really good. I got a bunch of his books behind me here. Bunch of good stuff. I mentioned Vodi Bakum all the time. I would recommend any of his books. I think they're great. So there's a few. What do you got, Lee?
Awesome. Actually, to go along with Beaky, I had along with Banner of Truth, which I absolutely love that publishing house. Beaky's own publishing house, Reformation Heritage Books, is a great place to find some really excellent resources. I believe you can search not only by author but by topic. They have a lot of children's material on there as well. And it's all going to be really solid. It's all coming from a reformed standpoint. So I can't recommend that website, that bookstore. If you want to go up to, I believe it's based in Grand Rapids, where they have an actual physical location. So if you want to make a pilgrimage for books,
I can't recommend it enough.
What's that?
I just make that clear. You said I can't recommend, and then you change. So I just want to make sure you say.
Oh, I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah.
Yes, 100% can recommend. 12 out of 10 would recommend every time.
Yes.
And then one other, the International Reformed Baptist Seminary, so IRBS, they have a great podcast that has Samwise Gamgee Renahan's dad, James the Gaffer Renahan, on there. And they again, this is another podcast tackling different theological topics, and they really go into depth. Like sometimes they'll take a topic and they'll do 3 or 4 episodes on that topic. There's a really good one where James Renahan talks about credo baptism and how Baptists baptize believers and why, and takes like 6 episodes explaining that theology from various standpoints, from the New Testament, from the Old Testament, from covenant theology, answers, objections. Really, really good, especially if you want to do a deep dive on a topic, but you don't want to necessarily sit and read a book for how long that takes. These would be worthy of actually publishing into a book, but I actually think they're most helpful on audio. And so that is called Theology in Particular. Is the name of that podcast. Very, very good. You might not listen to every episode, but if there's a particular topic they're on that interests you at a particular time, it will be excellent.
Yep.
Yeah, I one more I forgot to mention. Sermon audio. So you can there's actually an app you can download if you're an app person. Now, I'm not endorsing every single preacher on sermon audio because it's a lot, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch I don't know anything about. But if you have a preacher that is solid and you just want to find a good library of all of his sermons, great resource. You can do searches by a particular text. Just use discernment on who you're choosing as the preacher, but of course, the preacher, and so it's a great resource also if you just want to listen to some sermons.
Nice.
I would throw 9 Marks in there too their stuff is super easy to read. It's written specifically to be easy to read. It's from a Credo Baptist point of view.
Mm-hmm.
They've got podcasts. They've got several podcasts now.
And a YouTube channel.
Yeah, and YouTube. Yeah, and also like a bunch of books. I've used a lot of their stuff over the years. Yeah. Anyway, we probably could keep going for a whole episode on just cool publishers that we like.
Yeah.
But it feels like we need a blessing. I just feel like my feelings are my emotions are telling me I just need to know something true.
I feel one blessing short, at least. Yeah.
Here's something true that this can fit your blessing quota for this hour. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Amen. Amen.